Hi, my name's Jack from Painted Legion, and today we're going to look at the fastest of all Tyranid Hive Fleets, Hive Fleet Kraken. In this tutorial I'm going to show you a quick and easy recipe for the beige flesh of Hive Fleet Kraken so that you can get your models on the table as fast as possible. And I'll show you how to get Kraken's iconic, deep, angry red carapace. We're going to use simple tools and techniques that are suitable for any skill level, and if you stick around to the end of the video, I'll show you the 3 crucial techniques to getting the perfect freehand. And don't worry if you're a beginner or you've never tried freehand before, this is the perfect technique to start with and take your models to the next level. Now, quickly before we start, I do commission painting, so if you'd like me to paint a model for you, like any of these, then send me a message on Instagram or Facebook. Now, I've taken a lot of inspiration for this scheme from the GW Heavy Metal Painting Guide, and we'll go over fast ways to get those blue details on the gun, the orange vent details, and of course the spotted freehand they've done. That's all to come later. First, we're going to start with a white prime model with a layer of skeleton horde contrast over the entire model, including the chitin. Contrast paints are probably the best miniature painting product to come out in the decade. They have such a wide range of applications, but for this step, we'll use them as intended. We're looking for an even coat of this color over the white. The key here is to make sure there's not too much paint on the brush, and there are no places where there's too much paint collecting. Take some time to work your way around the model so you're getting a good staining of that color over the raised areas and definition in the recesses of the model without any loss of detail. Next, we'll do a dry brush layer, and I'm using an Artist Opus Series D medium brush for this. And to prepare it, I'm going to dampen the bristles slightly. To do this, I'll put some water on a piece of sponge, enough so that when I press my finger onto the sponge, it glistens slightly. If I'm getting water droplets on my finger, then it's too wet. Then I'll dab the brush onto the sponge and wipe it onto the back of my hand to remove the excess water. Doing this will reduce that dusty texture that you sometimes get from dry brushing. With the brush ready, I'll work the paint into the bristles on my texture pad, and for this step I'll be using a shabty bone. Brushing this over the model, I'm going to focus on all the raised details, but in particular the muscles on the arms, the side of the head, and the top of the tail. The contrast paint does really well to build the contrast between the raised details of the model and the recesses, but this dry brush layer will smooth out some of the pooling we get from the contrast paint and re-establish the details. Now, we could stop here, but as we're going to push the contrast on the chitin quite far, we're going to do one more highlighting step for the flesh, so that everything fits together nicely. We're going to do this again with dry brushing, this time with a much lighter dry brush of Vallejo Model Colors Ivory. I didn't prep my brush again in the same way as I did before, as my ivory is quite runny, and like I said, this is going to be a much lighter dry brush, so I'm going to focus this on the sharpest details. Now, with that done, we can start work on Kraken's iconic red carapace. Starting with Flesh Terror's red contrast paint, carefully work your way around the model, trying to avoid spilling over onto the flesh. But don't worry if you make any mistakes, you can clean them up again afterwards with your shabty bone. We're doing this in fairly thick coats so we get a nice strong color, but on larger models I'd recommend using 2 thinner coats so we can get a smooth layer over the biggest surfaces. Our previous layer of skeleton horde on the chitin will also help us define some of those shadows. That said, we're going to define the shadows even further by mixing Black Templar contrast paint with our Flesh Terror's red in a ratio of 1:1. And we're going to carefully paint this into the deepest shadows on our chitin. This should go between each of the chitin plates so that they're clearly visually separated, and you may also want to paint this onto any cracks or chips on the chitin. On larger chitin plates, make sure you're moving your brush into where you want the deepest shadow, so we don't get pooling of this color in strange places. Then, using a roughly 2:1 ratio of Black Templar to Skaven Blight Dinge, I'm going to quickly base coat the black areas of this model. These will be the hooves, talons, teeth, eye sockets, and gun. I want a more grey-brown for this color rather than a pure black, which is why I went for this mixture. And moving on to my favourite part of painting Tyranids, it's highlighting the chitin. We'll use Evil Sun Scarlet here for our first highlight, and we're going to paint it into the chitin using a feathering motion. Now, to do this, I want you to brace your 2 hands against one another so they're nice and stable, and you're going to hold your brush and your model somewhere between perpendicular and 45 degrees. And then you're going to do a quick brushing motion along the edge of the chitin. I've made a diagram here for you to reference for roughly how these lines should look. Try to do them in an irregular pattern to give the illusion of naturally occurring wear and tear on our angry little aliens. Focus longer lines on the sculpted areas or the sharp details on the chitin to emphasize the rough texture. With that done, we're going to do the same thing again, this time with Fire Dragon Bright. These will be far more sparse than the last step. We'll place these at the base of the longer lines of Evil Sun Scarlet and on the sharpest points of the chitin. Again, I've made a diagram for what I'm trying to explain here. I've updated this one with how you'll make these smaller lines. I chose this orange as it's a cooler, slightly desaturated orange so that we can really sell the effect of this bony chitin. You could use a Troll Slayer orange here instead if you wanted a more saturated red. We're done with the chitin now, and you can see just how much pushing that contrast with those highlights makes that red pop. Moving on to the smaller details, I'm going to mix Fire Dragon Bright in a ratio of 1:1 with Contrast Medium and paint it into the vents on the skin. Once that's dry, I'll wash the vents with Agrax Earthshade. On the black areas, I'll first do a highlight of Skaven Blight Dinge, followed by a final highlight of Storm Vermin Fur. Sometimes you see Kraken painted with a blue highlighted black. If that's what you prefer, then swap these colours out with Dark Reaper and Thunderhawk Blue. I prefer a brown black here because it's going to make those glowy blue gun pipes that we're about to do stand out a bit more. To do this, paint the pipes with Nighthaunt Gloom contrast paint, then once dry, highlight these with Fenrisian Grey, where we'll just touch the brush onto the points where we think light will catch the most. Next, take an off-white colour and paint the eyes, making sure to leave a black rim around each eye for definition. Then paint over this, starting with a layer or two of Trollslayer Orange, and finally we're going to highlight that with Uriel Yellow. With that out of the way, we can talk about the key steps that we're going to use to start out with freehand painting. If you haven't heard the term freehand painting before, freehand painting is when you paint something onto a model, not following any sculpted detail on the model itself. It's basically like drawing, which can be very daunting if you suck at drawing like I do. But as with most things, it just comes down to practice and following the fundamentals, which is why I think this is such a great place for beginners to start, because all we're going to be doing is painting tiny dots for this effect. So the first of the 3 tips I'd like to share today is having a reference. It's so much easier to do freehand when you have something to copy. I'm personally following the example on the GW painting guide for Kraken, and you can follow that too, or you can follow the way I've done it, the pictures that I've done. Next one is control. This one's fairly obvious, but you need to make sure that you have a brush with a good tip and that you thinned your paints down enough so that you can control it well. Also make sure that you wipe off the excess onto a paper towel before you start painting. And that way you're going to get as much control as you can with painting your details. And the final tip we're going to use here is using high pigmented paint. When you're painting a shape, it's easier to not make a mistake the less times you have to go over it. So the less layers we use on a shape, the less mistakes we're going to make. So using something like GW's base paints that have very high pigment will reduce the number of times that we'd have to go over any particular line or shape that we paint and reduce the risk of making a mistake. So starting off this spotted pattern effect, we're going to use Steel Legion Drab. The spots we paint shouldn't be perfectly round, and you can do this by using several smaller dots for each one. The spots that are closest to the chitin should be the largest, and make them smaller as you work your way away from the chitin. If you're not happy with how they look, just paint over it again with Ushabti Bone and have another go. I did the spotted pattern on the tops of each arm, the legs, and the base of the tail. So here's the finished model. If you like this tutorial, subscribe to catch my future tutorials. Up next will be a tutorial for the 3rd edition version of Hive Fleet Behemoth, and then a tutorial for Hive Fleet Hydra. If you want to see my other Tyranid tutorials, there's a link to that playlist on the right there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.